Hello, I'm Joe Norris, and I'm a professor of drama in education and applied theater at Brock University. Simply put, it's using drama for us to look at how to teach through dramatic activities and look at social issues through theater. Well, we find ourselves in a strange time, and I would much prefer to be with you in person than online. Most of my teaching is what I call dialogic. I lecture, but I also like to be interrupted throughout the lecture and move into more of a conversation. That's not as easily done in this platform. So what I have prepared for you is a movie version of what I may have delivered in person. Wishing you the best in these chaotic times.
Sometimes I find the best wisdom is in children's books. This one I'm going to read to you because it makes a point that underpins the entire lecture.
Tell me when. Okay.
When?
The true story of the Three Little Pigs, as told by John Shishka, illustrated by Lane Smith. Everybody knows the story of the Three Little Pigs, or at least they think they do. But I'll let you in on a little secret. Nobody knows the real story, because nobody has heard my side of the story. I'm the wolf, Alexander T. Wolf. You can call me Al. I don't know how this whole big bad wolf thing got started, but it's all wrong. Maybe it's because of our diet. Hey, it's not my fault wolves eat cute little animals like bunnies, sheep, and pigs. That's just the way we are. If cheeseburgers were cute, folks would probably think you were big and bad too. But like I was saying, the whole big bad wolf thing is all wrong. The real story is about a sneeze and a cup of sugar. Way back in Once Upon a Time, I was making a birthday cake for my dear old granny. I had a terrible sneezing cold, and I ran out of sugar. So I walked down the street to ask my neighbor for a cup of sugar. Now, this neighbor was a pig, and he wasn't too bright either. He had built his whole house out of straw. Can you believe it? I mean, who in his right mind would build a house of straw? Look at it there in the distance. So, of course, the minute I knocked on the door, it fell right in. I didn't want to just walk right into somebody else's house, so I called, Little pig, are you in? No answer. I was just about to go home without a cup of sugar for my dear old granny's birthday cake. That's when my nose started to itch. I felt a sneeze coming on. Well, I huffed and I snuffed and I sneezed a great sneeze. And you know what? That whole darn house of straw fell down, and right in the middle of the pile of straw was the first little pig, dead as a doornail. He had been home the whole time. It seemed like a shame to leave a pretty perfectly good ham dinner there lying in the straw, so I ate it up. Think of it as a big cheeseburger or a veggie burger just lying there. I was feeling a little better, but I still didn't have a cup of sugar, so I went to the next neighbor's house. This neighbor was the first little pig's brother. He was a little smarter, but not much. He had built his house out of sticks. I rang the doorbell on the stick house. Nobody answered. I called Mr. Pig. Mr. Pig, are you in? And he yelled back, Go away, Wolf, you can't come in. I'm shaving the hairs on my chinny chin chin. I just grabbed the doorknob when I felt another sneeze coming on, and I huffed and I snuffed, and I tried to cover my mouth, but I sneezed a great sneeze. And you're not going to believe it, but this guy's house fell down just like his brother's. When the dust cleared, there was the second little pig, dead as a doornail. Wolf's honor. Now, you know how food will spoil if you just leave it out in the open. So I did the only thing there was to do. I had dinner again. Think of it as a second helping. I was getting awfully full, but my cold was feeling a little better, and I still didn't have that cup of sugar for my dear old granny's birthday cake. So I went to the next house, the first and second little pig's brother. He must have been the brains of the family. He had built his house out of bricks. So I knocked on the brick house, no answer. I called Mr. Pig. Mr. Pig, are you in? And you know what that rude little porker answered? Get out of here, Wolf, and don't bother me again. Talk about impolite. He probably had a whole sack full of sugar, and he wouldn't even give me 1 cup for my dear, sweet old granny's birthday cake. What a pig. I was just about to go home and maybe make a nice birthday card instead of a cake, but I felt my cold coming on. I huffed, I snuffed, and I sneezed a great sneeze. Then the third little pig yelled, and your old granny can go sit on a pin. Now, I'm usually a pretty calm fellow, but when somebody talks about my granny like that, I go a little crazy. When the cops drove up, of course I was trying to break down the pig's door. And the whole time I was huffing and puffing and sneezing and making a great scene. The rest, they say, was history. Some of the headlines read, A.T. Wolf big and bad. Red Riding Hood settles dispute out of court. Wolf all huff and all puff. The news reporters found out about the 2 pigs I had for dinner. They figured a sick guy going to borrow a cup of sugar didn't sound very exciting. So they jazzed up the story with all that, a huff and puff and blow your host down. They made me the big bad wolf. That's it. The real story, I was framed. But maybe you could loan me a cup of sugar. The story ends with the comment, I've been framed. Knowledge that we really can't separate knowledge from the frame. And that's part of what postmodernism does. It begins to
challenge the frame upon which research is built, its underpinnings. If we look, for example, this presentation is based primarily on the concept of frame analysis and Goffman's work back in 1970s. In order to be able to read and understand research, we must understand both the content and the frame. As Marshall McLuhan says, the medium is the message. So the media we use frames what we know and how we know it. There's a painting. That painting looks very different and becomes very different with this frame. It would be different again if it had a very simple frame around it. So it's important as we read and make research findings that we recognizing how we are framing the content. A BBC documentary many years ago that was turned into a book, Ways of Seeing by John Berger, takes a look at art throughout the centuries and begins to show how it was framed from a very much a sexist, perhaps a misogynistic perspective, and how women were framed throughout the centuries. And it questions and challenges it. It also explores how we were taught to perceive things in certain ways. For those of you who are familiar with the movie The Matrix, it gets at the same issue. We have Neo, the main character, believing in a certain reality, and that reality is disrupted, and he is invited to take either the red or the blue pill. If you take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I'll show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. So what we're going to take a look at are some of the epistemological, ontological, axiological, and aesthetic undercurrents. Don't worry too much about these terms. I'll get at some other terms that are a little simpler to understand at this particular point. So, how do we frame things? Laura Richardson says, whenever we write science, we are telling some kind of story or some part of a larger narrative. Some of our stories are more complex, more densely described, and offer greater opportunities as emancipatory documents. Others are more abstract, distanced from lived experience, and reinscribe existent hegemonies. Even when we think we're not telling a story, we are at the very least embedding our research in a meta-narrative about, for example, how science progresses or how art is accomplished. So very much she's challenging us to begin to take a look at the narratives around which science and art are framed. A couple movies that get at that quite nicely are Big Fish, Tim Burton's movie, that begins to explore how we embellish or not embellish knowledge and how truth changes as a result of that. The Stories We Tell is a lovely story, documentary, not mockumentary per se, although it does challenge how we tell stories by our Canadian director and actress, Sarah Polley. Or did I frame her by saying actress instead of actor? So some of the key epistemological concepts that we're going to look at today, and I'll just rush through them now, are hermeneutics, representation, mediation, translation, intertextuality, reductionism, simulacra, deconstruction, power and privilege, hegemony, and arts-based research. One term is hermeneutics, and Hermes was a messenger from the gods to people and back again. But both spoke different languages. So Hermes recognized that there was something always lost in translation between the gods and people. The original meaning of the word hermeneutics was biblical, and it was the study of the Bible. At the turn of the 1900s, that changed to be the theory of interpretation. Representation, therefore, comes through. How do we frame our stories? How do we represent them? Paulo Freire talks about writing as a way of thinking, reading as a form of writing. I believe we don't represent. I question the word capture for two reasons. It's a violent term, and secondly, capture says we got it. We don't represent, we work within a meta-narrative that tells us how to tell stories in certain ways and not certain ways. So the way we tell is actually a framing. We also have some questions of whether truth or reality. I like Norman Denzin's term, partial truths, recognizing that everything is framed. Therefore, we recreate, or we could call it recreation, recreation, and we find a pleasure of the text. I ask, where is humor in scientific discoveries? Is that not part of being human? Let's take a look at a few different representations of a mountain. There's four here. There's a photograph, there's an artistic quilt, there's numbers, and there's words. One of the world's most massive volcanoes, Mount Rainier, can dominate the skyline for 100 miles before you reach the park named after it. At nearly 3 miles in height, Mount Rainier is the tallest peak in the Cascade Range. It dwarfs 6,000-foot surrounding summits, appearing to float alone among the clouds. So which is the more accurate? Which is a true representation? I would say they all have pros and they all have cons. Another example, we might be prone to say that the real Robin Williams is the one on the left because it's a photograph. At the same time, sometimes a caricature, with its embellishment, portrays certain characteristics better than a photograph. Which is the Robin Williams? With representation, the Hebrews recognized that by naming the deity, they were controlling and reducing the deity. So they used the term Yahweh, meaning that which cannot be named or labeled. For those of you who recognize the symbol here, the artist that was formerly known as Prince. Prince recognized the reductionism of labeling and naming. Kierkegaard said, if you label me, you negate me. Now, I haven't read much of Kierkegaard, and I got this quote actually from the movie Wayne's World.
Hi, Kierkegaard. Ding hi, Dick Van Patten. Gone. Yo, Sir Gone. 哈，好意，大多，三顺阳。
Now, does it make it any less or more legitimate that I got this quote from a movie as opposed to a philosophy text? The question is, how do we frame and legitimize knowledge? I talk about the representation, talking in relation to mediation. What media are we using? How do we name things? How do we define things? Are in a few different ways. Joe McLeod talks about it as wings: words, images, numbers, gestures, and sounds. To provide data in words is very different than numbers, and very different again with images. So how do we mediate or represent what we believe we know? A graduate student of mine who took an arts-based course had some of the people talk about their involvement in a program in the North, to talk about their feeling of self prior to entering the program and exiting the program. I was talking with a colleague, a curriculum consultant, a number of years ago, and he said, the only way to prove the value of something is measuring it. And I said, no, there's other ways besides measure, although measure is legitimate. And I showed him these two. And after he saw the second one, he said, wow. And I asked, when was the last time you said wow to a statistic? There are many ways of mediating what we know. Unfortunately, many of them are considered alternative at best. Translation, then, is ephemeral. Knowledge is ephemeral. There's no one-to-one equivalent. All things, even what I'm saying to you, is going to be taken differently based upon how you frame what I say. So there are things lost in translation. In language, there's commonalities and there's differences. Gadamer talks about the space between languages.
Yes. 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 Yes.
So let's take a look at this transcript. It was originally oral, it went to written, and it was back to oral. Morabian and Ferris say that 38% of the meaning of the spoken word is in how it is said, 55% in body language and facial expressions, and only 7% in the denotation of the words. So 93% is lost in translation. But that's the same with numbers. So for example, student A is great at algebra and okay in geometry, gets 100 in algebra, 50 in geometry, the total grade is 75. Person B is just the opposite, 50 and 100, totaling 75. And the third one is pretty good at all three, 75, 75, and 75. So my question is, does 75 equal 75 equal 75? No. We tend to equate numbers as being the definite truth. but it also reduces the number of things out of it. These three people are very different from one another. Let's take a look at the words. This is a translation called First Ice. A girl freezes in a telephone booth. In her drafty overcoat, she hides. Second version, not called First Ice, but First Frost. A girl is freezing in a telephone booth, huddled in her flimsy coat. There's truths there, but there's textures that are very different. Similar, but different poems, different translations. Intertextuality comes into play. If some people read the First Frost first and then First Ice, and others read First Ice to First Frost. So very much intertextuality talks about how previous experiences frame current ones. Many versions of Der Panther. So, I'm going to give the word wings. And think about what images you bring up with wings. It could have been like this, or this, or this, or this. Very few, probably this TV show, which was done maybe before some of you were born. And this. Jacques Derrida in Deconstruction talks about the concept of trace. So in every word we read, there are traces of the intertextuality of previous meanings and experiences with this word. So each of us with different histories will bring different readings to just about every word. So when we read transcripts, we may be overlaying what we read with our own sense of inflection. Simulacra is another one. By Baudrillard talks about many years ago, map makers were judged by how their maps reflected reality. Now, reality is judged by the map. The representation precedes the experience. Merleau-Ponty talks about we are predisposed. Once we know what a wolf is, we are now predisposed to giving meaning to the wolf based upon our first one. Hence, the true story of the Three Little Pigs is beginning to question that frame, that predisposition. I'm doing research right now about misdiagnosis. And a lot of misdiagnoses are based upon frames of gender and race. And we're beginning to help people begin to experience how they interpret and challenge their implicit biases. Deconstruction, then, is a critical way of reading the word and the world. One aspect of deconstruction is logocentrism. It examines our language and how it's subdivided into binary opposites. Not all cultures work this way. Paula Underwood says words and phrases means different things in different cultures. In my tradition, instead of bifurcating life with oppositional nouns like health and sickness, we only use the positive term health. This comes from the great hoop of life. The way we describe specific condition is we are moving toward or are we moving away from health. Location and direction are the critical elements. With binary opposites, we tend to make some terms dominant and some terms subordinate or pejorative. day and night, male and female, objective and subjective. And this really comes into play on what is legitimate research, as well as reality as fact and fantasy and fiction. Are not hypotheses fantasy, work play, certainty, uncertainty, all of which are different ways we frame what we believe is better and what we believe is less than. An axiological dimension of science and research deals with concepts of power and privilege. What is told and what is not told. These two individuals were very involved in the creation of the Blalock-Taussig shunt, the first heart surgery in November 29, 1944. Blalock-Taussig shunt. Vivian Thomas was not acknowledged at all. He fully participated in developing the Blue Baby operations, but he was not given credit for his contribution, nor was he acknowledged to be a leading instructor of surgery for more than 3 decades. It was a 1989 article, Something the Lord Made, that began to talk about his contributions, and it was turned into a movie. Same could be said of the null curriculum of science in relation to the movie Hidden Figures, and also a recent one, The Dig, is academic exclusion because a major player did not have an academic degree. The use of the Navajo language in coding for the Second World War in the Pacific was dramatized in The Windtalkers. Who is featured center and who is secondary or the shadow behind? We have a history of racism and sexism in the way we tell science. Postmodernism, we cannot separate the knowledge from the frame. Therefore, we have to read research in relation to what is told and not told of gender, race, ability, etc. As a result, we have been framed by our upbringing, by our education, what we aren't taught, that's called the null curriculum, and how we are taught, the hidden curriculum. I found this last week in relation to a news article. How do we reframe? Framing Britney Spears unravels a heartbreaking pop mystery. There's many stories of Britney, and what's really interesting in this photograph, we can see her being framed or staged. We are all framed, and we frame ourselves. So the key word for me is wings. Words, images, numbers, gestures, and sounds. And how most often research is predominantly words and numbers. Patricia Levy begins to define research into 3 categories: quantitative, traditional, qualitative, and arts-based. And the one I just want to highlight just briefly here is quantitative tries to prove and convince, traditional qualitative, persuade, and arts-based compel. And I believe that by dramatizing the data, we create research dissemination that compels. Key to arts-based research is what I call the contexture, the textures of the images, gestures, and sounds. Two books that deal with this, one by a colleague of mine, Johnny Saldana, called Ethnodrama, and my one called Playbuilding. I'm currently writing a second edition. A lot of the research is disseminated on my webpage, and it was funded by the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council. So we'll take a look at a couple of dramatizations as examples right here. This scene is one of many that were based upon interviews conducted at the YWCA, Women's Shelter, and then turned into dramatizations. That's an example of how we can take research to make compelling stories. In this case, it's a composite of how people felt they were treated on the street, coming and going from the shelter, and in the downtown in general. What we did, however, is not dramatize it in the regular location. Rather, we took a photograph in another city, and we used a green screen that served as a background. You can hear the footsteps are of a floor, not of a sidewalk. The question is, changing this data, does it make it any more or less legitimate? The next one is the one that you'll be working in more detail in your tutorials. Again, looking at the implicit bias of the helping professions. In your tutorials, you'll be working with this example of arts-based research. You'll be asked to take a look at these 6 sculptures and examine your own implicit biases as whom you would prefer to work with and whom you would prefer not to. Something that many of us do many times throughout our educational experience. It's an example of how we can take arts-based research and disseminate it as arts-based pedagogy. The challenge? You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. You can't separate the research from the frame. As a result, it's more complex than rocket science. reduced from the oral to the written. It's a partial truth.